I've spent years diving deep into the world's most obscure urban legends. My YouTube channel, The Urban Legend Explorer, started off as a small project, something I did in my free time. Now, it's become a full-time job. I travel to haunted places, explore forgotten towns, and chase down stories that most people only whisper about in the dead of night. It's my thing. Documenting what people fear, capturing it on camera, and trying to figure out what's real and what's just a tall tale. I've traveled across the globe, from haunted forests in Europe to abandoned buildings in the States. But I had always wanted to take my exploration to Japan. Japanese urban legends have a depth and darkness to them that I found irresistible. The folklore is so rich, so deeply rooted in the culture, that even the most logical minds can't help but feel a shiver crawl up their spine when hearing the tales. You know the ones: Kuchisake Onna, the slit-mouthed woman, Tekete, and Tomino's Hell. But there was one urban legend that stood out above all the rest: Hachishaku-sama, or as she's known in English, the 8-foot-tall woman. The legend of Hachishaku-sama is one of the most chilling urban legends in Japan. She's a spirit or entity that appears as a towering woman, over 8 feet tall, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress and hat. The most disturbing part of the legend is the sound she makes, a deep, echoing voice that repeats the word po, po, po as she approaches. Those unlucky enough to encounter her are marked for death. She follows them slowly but relentlessly until they die within a few days. Her victims are usually children or young people, but there's no hard rule. What makes her especially terrifying is that once you've seen her, there's no easy way to escape. She'll follow you everywhere, no matter where you go. Your only chance at survival is performing an ancient ritualistic escape process, but even then, the odds aren't in your favor. When I read about her, something inside me clicked. I knew I had to explore the legend. I had to see if there was any truth to it. It took months to arrange the trip. Japan wasn't exactly a quick weekend getaway, but I finally made it happen. I booked my flight, packed my gear, and started researching the best places to hunt down these legends. I figured I'd start by interviewing locals about Hachishaku-sama, see if anyone had stories about her, or if there were places where she had reportedly been seen. My first few days in Japan were incredible. I explored haunted shrines, ancient forests, and even spoke to a few people who claimed they had experienced paranormal phenomena. None of it really stuck with me. Sure, there were some eerie moments, but nothing that screamed real. That's what I was chasing. Something that felt genuine. Something that sent chills down your spine. That all changed when I reached the outskirts of a small town nestled in the Japanese countryside. This wasn't a place you'd find in any tourist guidebook. It was far from any major city, surrounded by dense forests and vast stretches of farmland. I had been tipped off by one of the locals about the town, telling me it had a reputation for strange occurrences, particularly related to Hachishaku-sama. "Be careful," the man had warned me. "Once you see her, she never lets go." At the time, I shrugged it off. These kinds of warnings always came with the territory, and honestly, I thought it was all part of the fun. I wasn't scared, just intrigued. But looking back, I realize how foolish I was. I should have listened. When I arrived, the town looked almost like it had been frozen in time. It had that same eerie feeling small, isolated places often do. Quiet, too quiet, with the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The streets were empty, and most of the buildings were old, worn down by the passage of time. I noticed the houses were spread far apart, each one with large stretches of land between them. That kind of isolation made me feel uneasy, but I pushed the thought aside. I began asking around, seeing if anyone would talk to me about Hachishaku-sama. Most people were reluctant. Some flat out refused to answer my questions, quickly closing their doors or turning away when I mentioned her name. A few gave me worried looks and told me to leave, to go back to the city before something happened. It was frustrating, but eventually I found someone willing to talk. It was an elderly woman living alone in a small, traditional house on the outskirts of town. She seemed hesitant at first, but after I told her about my YouTube channel and how I wanted to document the legend for the world to see, she relented. "She comes for those who seek her," the woman said, her voice shaky. "You'll hear her before you see her. If you hear the sound, poke, 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 you must run. Do not look at her. Do not acknowledge her. If she sees you, It's already too late. I thanked her for her time, even though her warning felt like the same kind of folklore I'd heard in countless other places. Creepy, sure, but nothing to worry about. But then she handed me something. A small charm, made of knotted string with a tiny bell attached to it. "Take this," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "It won't stop her, but it might give you a chance." I didn't know what to make of it, but I took the charm, thanked her, and left. It was just a story, I told myself. It had to be. I clipped the charm to my backpack and went on my way. That night, I decided to explore a more remote part of the countryside, where I had heard rumors of strange sightings. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the air was thick with the humidity of late summer. I was walking along a narrow dirt road, lined with tall trees that stretched up into the sky like dark sentinels. The town was far behind me now, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was perfect for filming. I set up my camera, documenting the surrounding area, giving my usual commentary for the channel. Everything seemed normal, uneventful. I was about to pack up and head back when I heard it. Po, po, po. The sound was faint, almost like an echo, but unmistakable. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped, listening intently, hoping it was just the wind or some distant animal call, but then it came again. Po, po, po. It was closer now. My heart began to race as I scanned the darkening landscape around me. I didn't see anything, but the sound kept coming, rhythmic and unsettling, like someone calling out in the distance. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the locals messing with me or some weird echo in the trees, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. Po, po, po. I grabbed my camera, pointing it in the direction the sound was coming from. The sun had fully set now and the darkness was creeping in, swallowing up the road ahead. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, but I kept filming, hoping to capture something. Anything. And then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the trees towering over the landscape was a woman. No, not a woman. A figure, impossibly tall, her head nearly brushing the tops of the trees. She was wearing an old, white dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of her face. Her limbs were too long, her movements too slow, too deliberate. My blood turned to ice. Po, po, po. The sound was coming from her. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me from the edge of the forest. But I could feel her presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air had thickened with her arrival. I froze, my camera still recording, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could barely breathe, barely think. The stories flooded my mind, the warnings, the legend. Po, po, po. Her voice echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second, but she didn't move. She didn't have to. I knew she could reach me, no matter how far I ran. She was Hachishaku-sama, and she had found me. Finally, my body reacted. I turned and ran, the camera bouncing in my hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The sound followed me, echoing in the night. Po, po, po. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The old woman's words echoed in my mind. Don't look at her, don't acknowledge her. But I could feel her behind me, her presence closing in, her towering figure looming over me. I don't remember how long I ran. The next thing I knew, I was back at the edge of the town, gasping for breath, my legs trembling and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The small village was eerily quiet, and the streets were empty, as if no one dared to come outside. I looked around, trying to catch my breath, the sweat dripping down my face, but the sound was still there. Po, po, po. I could hear it, faint in the distance now, but growing louder with every beat of my heart. I forced myself to keep running, trying to get further into town, to find some semblance of safety. I had heard the stories of Hachishaku-sama, but nothing could have prepared me for the overwhelming terror of seeing her in the flesh. My legs felt like they were going to give out at any moment, but I pushed myself further, turning down one narrow alleyway after another, hoping, praying that I could somehow lose her. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew the truth. You can't outrun her. You can't outrun death. Eventually, I stumbled into the same elderly woman's house I had visited earlier that day, my body shaking with exhaustion. I didn't even knock. I just burst through the door, collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. She was there, sitting quietly in the corner of the dimly lit room, as if she had been waiting for me. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm, but filled with a deep, unsettling knowledge. I nodded, barely able to speak. She's coming." I managed to choke out between breaths. "I heard her," the woman said softly, her eyes narrowing as she nodded. "You're marked now. Once you hear her voice, it's too late. She'll never stop following you." I collapsed into a chair, my mind racing. What had I done? What had I gotten myself into? "Is there any way to stop her?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Anything I can do?" The old woman stood up slowly and walked toward me, her frail body moving with an unsettling calmness. "There is an ancient ritual," she said, her eyes dark and heavy. "It's your only chance. But it's not guaranteed to work, and you'll have to leave immediately." I was desperate, terrified beyond words. "I'll do it," I said, not even thinking twice. "Just tell me what to do." She nodded and motioned for me to follow her. In the back of her house was a small, musty room filled with old scrolls and dusty objects. She handed me a large sheet of rice paper, covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. "You'll need to wrap this around you and carry it at all times for the next 3 days. It will keep her at bay, but it won't last forever. During these 3 days, you must never leave your house, and you must block every door and window with salt. If you survive those 3 days, you might be spared." "Might?" I asked, my heart sinking. "You mean there's no guarantee?" The old woman's expression darkened. "The ritual has worked for some. For others, it wasn't enough, but it's your only hope." With shaking hands, I took the rice paper and left her house, the weight of what she had said sinking in. I could still hear the faint echoes of Hachishaku-sama's voice, "Poke, poke," haunting me even as I walked back to my temporary lodging. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long. Every dark corner felt like it hid her towering figure, watching and waiting. I spent the rest of that night in a panic. I followed the old woman's instructions to the letter, wrapping myself in the rice paper and covering every entry point of my small apartment with thick lines of salt. My mind was racing, torn between disbelief and overwhelming terror. Could this really work? Could salt and paper stop her? It seemed ridiculous, but I had seen her. She was real. I wasn't taking any chances. The first night passed slowly. I didn't sleep. Every sound outside made my heart race. Every gust of wind sent chills down my spine. I sat in the center of the room, clutching the rice paper to my chest, my eyes fixed on the door. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, and I kept imagining her standing just outside, waiting for her chance to break through. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had survived. The salt around the doors and windows remained undisturbed, and there was no sign of her. Maybe the ritual was working after all. The second night, however, was worse. It started the same way as the first. Uneventful, but tense. I had eaten little and barely moved all day, afraid that if I let my guard down for even a second, she would find a way in. But as midnight came and went, I began to hear the sound again. "Pooh, pooh, pooh." It was faint at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I could hear it outside, circling the house, as if she was searching for a way in. My hands trembled as I clutched the rice paper, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I pressed my ear against the wall, and for a brief moment I could hear her, breathing. Slow, steady breaths, just outside the window. "Poke, poke, poke." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound was relentless, growing louder, more oppressive. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the very air had thickened with her presence. I wanted to run, to leave, but I knew there was nowhere to go. She would follow me. There was no escaping her. And then there was silence. The sudden lack of sound was more terrifying than the chanting had been. I knew she was still out there, waiting, but she was toying with me now. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, every second filled with unbearable tension. And then, without warning, there was a knock at the door. Just one. I froze. My entire body locked up in fear. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock, louder this time. I stared at the door, my heart racing, praying that the salt would hold, that the ritual would work. But then I heard her voice, clearer than ever. Let me in. The third night was the longest night of my life. I knew she was still out there, waiting. I could feel her presence, hovering just outside, her impossibly tall figure looming over the house. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every sound, every creak made my heart race with terror. The rice paper was my only protection, the salt lines my last barrier. When the morning finally came, I realized I had made it. 3 nights. I had survived. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that she wasn't done with me. I left Japan the next day, never looking back. I stopped exploring urban legends after that. I stopped chasing ghosts, stopped seeking the unknown. Because some legends aren't just stories. Some legends are real. And if you're ever in Japan and you hear a faint, haunting voice chanting "po po" in the distance, don't look. Run. And don't ever look back.